What's the creepiest thing from your childhood that still stands out as if it occurred yesterday? Not so much creepy as scary, but my mom and stepdad had made friends with a couple and spent a lot of time around my family. The wife of the couple eventually tried to become my mom. She dressed alike, styled her hair alike, affected mannerisms of my mom, and insisted I call her mom. She and my stepdad ended up sleeping together, and then tried to run my mom and me off the road in a jealousy-fueled psychotic episode. I was 7 to 8 years old at the time. When I was around 8 years old, I was playing over at a friend's house. This blue car drove around the block, then circled around and pulled up across the street from us. The man driving was just sitting there, the window was rolled up, but we could tell he was looking at us. After a minute or two he got out of his car and walked right up my friend and me. He said there was an emergency with my mom and told me to hurry and go with him. He grabbed my wrist and started pulling me to the car. He had this creepy smile, like a look of immense satisfaction. My friend Mindy started yelling at him to let me go. She then threw a rock at him, missed, and broke his car window instead. The man looked furious and started to walk towards her, dragging me along as he did so. I decided that was a good time to hit him in his beanbag as hard as I could. I didn't hit him quite right, maybe not low enough because he didn't act hurt at all, but it was enough to make him flinch. I jerked my hand out of his and ran back Mindy, and we bolted into her house. She told her dad what happened and called the cops. He got his gun and went outside to confront the guy, but he was gone. As far as I know, they never caught the guy. It's always creeps me out to think of the things he was planning on doing to me. Copying and pasting from another thread. I've had a handful of creepy things happen in my life. Here's one when I was around 8 years old and I lived on a military base in Hawaii. My older brother and I used to explore all over the woods and streets, but the oddest place we kept coming back to was this sort of concrete sewer opening that had a metal grate over it. It was located at a dugout ditch by the side of the road. Standing over it looking down, you could see it was a pretty deep drop. So, me and my brother used to talk to this thing that lived in the sewer. It started one day when we were dropping rocks down inside it to hear the echo, and then we started yelling into it and something answered back. It was this echoed noise that sounded kind of like faraway water running in a pipe, but also kind of like the songs whales make, all mixed together. It's really hard to explain. It sounded very faint but very distinct. So we yelled again and it responded again. The noises lasted for maybe 5 to 10 seconds then stopped. Some answers were longer than others. We kept testing it, we were asking it questions like, "Do you live in the pipes? Are you a ghost?" etc. And when we were finished speaking it would make the sound again. The space of time between our questions and the corresponding sound varied, sometimes it was immediate and sometimes there was a short wait. We weren't even freaked out though, we were kids and we just thought it was really cool and weird. So we said goodbye and left, but we checked back the next day and it was still there. We waited in silence before we initiated conversation, trying to listen for the noise, but there was nothing. Then we started yelling and it started back up again. And so we just kept coming back and talking to it. We always said hello and goodbye. We would experiment with the things we said to see if we got different reactions. Sometimes we would insult it and then say just kidding, right afterward, being dumb. I would bring my friends to show it off, but they would get creeped out and want to leave. Once, my brother and I brought a whole group of kids, but the noise never came back. We were just hollering into emptiness like idiots and they all thought we made it up. Then when I went back to basically ask, "Where were you, dude?" it took like 10 minutes to hear it again. Weirdly, I had forgotten all about this incident until a couple of years ago. I was so young when it happened that I just accepted it as a bizarre but mundane part of my life. I had entire meaningful chat sessions with this thing. My brother had forgotten all about it too, until I brought it up a couple years ago. The memories came flooding back and he recalled the same thing I did, but we still have no idea what it could be. I spoke to it all the time, and the last thing I said to it was when I said goodbye because our family was moving. When I was about 7, I was at home with my brothers and the babysitter was watching us. My mom was really into antiques at the time. She had this antique chest. It was quite big. I was always weary of it. It just gave me the creeps. I pleaded with my mom to get rid of it. I'd have nightmares about this chest. So, I'm in the living room and heard the sound of the lid creaking open. Immediately this puts me on high alert and piques my curiosity. I look over to chest and see the lid opening. What I see next I will never forget. I see this white pale hand slipping out of the chest. It was opening and a pale white hand was emerging. I screamed. I started crying. The babysitter said it was my brother playing tricks on me. He was in the other room though. The chest was packed full of our childhood artwork and old documents and paper. There was no room for my brother to hide inside. Not my experience, but my mom and aunt's. I've posted this before. My mom and aunt have an interesting story with an old haunt. They grew up in the hollers in eastern Kentucky. One night when they were 7 or 8 years old, they were sleeping in their grandma's house when my aunt awoke to someone whispering her name from the end of the bed. She said it sounded so terrifying that she was afraid to look, but it kept doing it. She shook my mom enough to wake her up, and my mom too heard it calling my aunt's name. They had the blankets over their head and my mom finally got the courage to look down to the end of the bed. She said there were 2 male figures, bloody, slightly decaying and looking like they had been in a car accident. The figures stood at the end of their bed all night, whispering their name while my mom and aunt hid under the blankets. The figures eventually vanished before dawn. My mom and aunt swear truth to this story still today. I've asked them to tell me it many times over the years and it never changes. My aunt hates talking about it because she thinks it could invite them in. Anyway, when they told my grandpa about it that next morning, he said that he knew several people who had similar experiences, and that those figures were called Bloody Bones and Rawhead in that area. A simple Google search will tell you that these figures existed in Southern folklore. When I was 7, I saw a 7-foot-tall, very very thin humanoid creature running through our cornfield one evening. That was 35 years ago and I will never forget that. Edit. I was standing about 50 yards away and had a slightly elevated view of about the first 100 or so yards of the start of the field. It must have been closer to the house, by some of our machinery because it took off very quickly straight into the field. I was paralyzed with fear, my brain couldn't process what I just saw. I ran back inside and had some sort of panic attack. I've actually stopped telling people this story because people just think I'm crazy, but I saw too much detail. I wish I hadn't seen it but I did. And I have to live with the fact that there are things out there we don't know about. Well, when I was a toddler I was walking through the mall with my mom. Nothing crazy, right? Well, I have this Minnie Mouse that I still have to this day with me. As I'm walking I have her dragging on the floor. I let go and I swear the Minnie Mouse stood still and began to walk like I was still holding it. I told my mom to hold Minnie Mouse for the rest of the day. I was about 7 or 8 years old, the only one in the house since I was sick and everyone else wanted to enjoy the sun. I had just walked to the bathroom and closed the door when I hear a girl's voice yelling, "Please don't Daddy. Not again Daddy." And a lot more crying and no's. I was the only girl in the family, and like I said, everyone was outside. I had an imaginary friend named Skell. My mother told me that she would hear me laughing and talking in my room alone, and occasionally hear me upset telling Skell that it was too late to play and that I wanted to sleep. It got creepy when the name Skell was written in perfect cursive on a window that was foggy from the outside. My mother switched rooms with me and it all stopped after that. When I was around 9 my mom had bought this giant red Chinese cabinet online, and was having it delivered to our house. The lady who is delivering it comes by, along with some old man. The lady, the old man, and my mom are all sitting in the living room talking about who knows what. I end up walking downstairs to get something to eat and see them all. I go to say hi and am greeted by the women and the old guy. After that I get my food and go back upstairs. Eventually after they leave, I go and talk to my mom and ask who the people were. She says that the lady was there to deliver the giant red cabinet. I then ask who the old guy was and my mom goes dead quiet. She says there wasn't any old guy, to which I say there most certainly was, and we get into a small argument with me swearing on my life that someone else was there. My mom calls the lady again and she ends up sending some pictures of her deceased grandpa after I described what he looked like. It was a total match. To this day I know I saw someone with her, but it still creeps me out a bit when I found out exactly who it was that I saw. When I was around 13 I was at the public library reading at a table, and this very overweight man who seemed to be mentally handicapped came in and sat down by me. He was wearing a baseball cap, shorts, and a shirt that was all stained down the front. The stains were coming from his mouth and looked like barbecue sauce. He freaked me right out and I had this overwhelming sense of dread, but the worst part was the smell, a rotting sickly sweet smell that made me feel sick to my stomach. I had to leave after a few minutes because the smell was so bad. I realized a few days later that the smell was the smell of old blood, and that what I thought was barbecue sauce smeared all around his mouth and down his shirt must have been blood. I saw him one more time outside a mall near the library and then never again. Felt the same dread upon seeing him, same blood around his mouth and down his shirt. I sometimes wonder if I hallucinated him, as I was going through a very strange and stressful period in my life. I wonder this because no one else seemed to notice or were bothered by him, and I lived in that area another 10 years and never saw him a third time, but I know there are reasonable explanations for both. For example, people did notice him but were trying not to in order to be polite. He was just passing through the neighborhood. When I was around 11 years old, I was at home babysitting my younger cousins while my mom went to the grocery store. We lived in a basement apartment. The basement only had 2 apartments that were right across from each other. On the side our apartment was on there was the laundry room. The laundry room was fairly large and that's where most people who had bikes would chain them. I was watching television with my younger cousins when I heard a knock on the door. This was super weird to me already because literally no one ever visited us out of nowhere, and my mother had her own key. I was still super short so I had to get a small chair to stand on so I could look through the peephole. I looked through the peephole and there was some giant dude I had never seen before. I remember saying hi, and then saying, "Can I help you?" The door was still definitely locked though. This man proceeds to tell me that his bike was stolen from the laundry room. He didn't continue talking though so I said, I'm sorry? He proceeds to repeat himself but then adds that he knows what his bike smells like. I remember being so effing confused and could not imagine where he was going with this. I said, "I'm sorry, your bike got stolen?" Then he says that because he knows what his bike smells like, that I have to open the door so he can smell my hands. Smell my effing hands. I got so freaked out that I almost started crying and kept saying, "I'm sorry but I didn't steal your bike." He starts getting super aggressive and pounding on the door and saying that he needs to smell my hands so he can make sure that I didn't steal his bike. I then got off the chair and just started screaming, "Mom," over and over again as if she was home. This is interesting because I speak a different language and would never call my mother mom. I did this throughout the apartment as if I was going to get her, and when I checked afterwards he was gone. Still one of the creepiest things I've ever encountered. I told my mom when she got home and she flipped out. Never saw that dude again. On Christmas morning when I was 5 I woke up really early to see if Santa came. I saw all of the presents and went to pee real quick before waking everyone up. When I walked into the bathroom, there he was, Santa Claus taking a dump. I freaked out and ran to my bed, thinking that he might take the presents away if I made a commotion. I didn't tell my parents until years later, and they seemed weirded out by it since they never dressed up as Santa nor did anyone who ever stayed with us. They told me it was a dream but I came to find out later that in the same year, apparently dozens of houses had been broken into around the holidays. The only few witnesses all described a man dressed as Santa Claus. I remember one day I was at my grandparents' house. They lived in an apartment in New York and I remember my grandmother telling me that tonight, we're all gonna sleep in the same room, and that whatever you hear, don't open the front door. Mind you, I'm maybe like 6 so being in the same bed as my grandparents wasn't abnormal. But then in the middle of the night, I hear a knock on the door. Both my grandparents immediately get up, as do I. My grandfather just motions for me to stay in bed. Mind you, it's New York so the apartment is extremely tiny, the bedroom is right next to the front door. Anyways, my grandmother has her whole body against the door, she's yelling at something to go away. I hear someone trying to kick the door. I hear heavy crap being slammed against the door. Me being a craphead I kept telling my grandmother to let them in. And I think I actually heard one of them tauntingly say, "Yeah grandma, let us in." My grandma pushes me back, still pressing her body against the door. Eventually I think the people just left and I go right back to sleep. My grandparents only spoke Spanish and I didn't, but I don't recall anyone ever talking about the incident. The next day things were just right back to normal. Mother's ex-husband trying to get in the house. Shouting and crying, waving a knife then his hand through the letterbox. He pulled his hand back and started screaming, then fell quiet. I could still hear him breathing, so I knew he was there. The letterbox slipped back open and his hand came through holding something weird and bloody. It was his skin. He'd cut out his tattoo of my mother's name and pushed it through the letterbox. My mother wasn't even home, so I just left it there. My family lived in the boondocks when I was 7, and we had this long and winding driveway where the last bend would open up to a larger area for parking to the left side of our house. It was a perfect setup for a baseball game, which we had many over the years. We were playing one such game at dusk when my dad came out and said it was time for everyone to come inside. My oldest cousin, who was at bat, looked like he was going to argue, but then my dad gave him this look and my cousin then overly dramatic said, "Oh yay. I agree. Let's all just walk inside now." He went to his brothers and hoisted the smallest on under his arm and grabbed the other by his hand and slowly walked toward the house. Me? I'm in the outfield, in the driveway right at the last bend. I've missed the whole point apparently that everyone else had picked up on, because I'm just standing there wondering why everyone was acting so strangely. My dad calls me in this kind of sing-song's voice, "Hey. Why don't you walk this way?" Now, my dad is not a sing-song voice kind of man. He is loud and his voice always carries a room. He's that guy that everyone thinks is yelling all the time, but it was just his normal volume. I started that way and he met me and threw me over his shoulder and turned around to walk back into the house. I looked up from my upside down position to where I had just been standing to see a huge panther just laying there at the crook of the bend. After everyone was inside, we of course had our noses to the windows. The panther got up, walked around to each base before sauntering back down the driveway. My dad got a shotgun the following weekend that is ceremoniously mounted above the front door of every house they've lived in after. My dad passed away when I was only 3 years old. Even though I was young, I still had a couple of hazy memories of him. Then, when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I was taking a bath one night and I looked up and saw 2 men standing across the other side of the room. When I yelled out in fright, I could then hear my mother's running steps coming up the hall, and the 2 men just faded out. When Mum finally got me calm, she asked me to describe them. One I described as my dad. Now any rational person or psychologist can say that my kid mind was playing tricks and bringing up memories of dad. But the other man that I described, after thinking about it, Mum said sounded like my grandfather, my father's father. Now I had never met the man as he and my grandmother divorced years before, never even saw a picture of him to that point. Yet still described him. Years later, after getting in contact with his second wife, she sent me a picture, and I would still swear to this day it was him. One day my parents picked me up from school and handed me a box. Inside was a thin sickly kitten they had found in a dumpster. I was instantly smitten, and he grew into the greatest cat I've ever had. He followed us around, rode on our shoulders, slept with us at night. He'd even do rounds, where he'd routinely check every room and make sure everyone was okay. He saved me from a lizard once and wouldn't leave my side until I stopped crying. Seriously, the best darn cat. My neighbors didn't think so. They thought he was unlucky, and the one time Kitty was outside on his own, they attacked him and ruptured his spleen. He died that evening. That night, as I cried in bed, laying on my stomach, I heard the door creak open. I stopped crying and everything was still. Then I felt my blanket shift, and I can remember distinctly the 4 individual paws as they slowly patted over, turned a circle on my back and stopped. I felt a weight on my back followed by a gentle purring. Within a minute it was gone. I choose to believe it was my kitty checking in on me one last time, making sure I was okay before he left. Of course, it could just as well be the imagination of a grief-ridden child who had never known death before. As a child I used to suffer from night terrors. Every night my parents would be woken up either to me screaming or to me standing over their bed. One night when I was about 10, I had a nightmare that my grandfather had died, and while I was still asleep I got out of bed and walked to my parents' room. I walked around to my mom's side of the bed, as it was her father I had dreamed about, and stood there staring at her. The feeling of someone staring at her woke her up. And as soon as she did I said, "Granddad is dead," and immediately I woke up and started crying. Obviously concerned, my mother let me sleep in her bed but I could not fall asleep. About an hour later the phone rang. My mum got up and walked to the kitchen to answer it, and a few seconds later I could hear her crying. My dad had been woken by now and was trying to console her, while I was pretending to be asleep in their bed. And the last thing I remember from that night was my mum choking out the words, "My dad's dead." It's been 9 years and I am still freaked out by it. That's easy to answer. I was about 7 years old and I went to sleep as usual, right? Well, I had slept in the evening too, so I had trouble sleeping for the night. Eventually I suppose I fell asleep, but at some point, I fell outside of the bed and to the floor, which had never happened to me before. Then I vividly remember being dragged under the bed, and I was too scared to move from there or do anything. Eventually I fell asleep under the bed, which must have freaked my mother out when she came to woke me up in the morning. The next day I put many stuff I rarely used under my bed so there's no space for anything to go in or out of there. I was at a sort of dormitory camp facility on some course or other. The buildings were used for all sorts of youth courses and were awful old concrete towers which have since been demolished. A group of us decided to make a Ouija board. I was probably about 10. We stole a glass tumbler from the canteen at lunch and made a makeshift circle of letters drawn on scraps of paper. Not much happened at first, but then we started getting answers. Name? Adam. How did you die? Fire. 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 How old were you? 6. 6. 6. I called bullcrap because the answers were so cliché. Then someone asked, "Are you in the room?" Yes. Where? Bed. We numbered the beds 1 to 6. Which bed? 6. Obviously. So I said, "Prove it." A piece of A4 paper on bed 6 literally floated up a few inches, flipped over and landed back down. Cue us all absolutely losing our minds. Then the glass went crazy. Skidding everywhere. The same words. Adam. Fire. Number 6. Die. The glass eventually slid across the floor and smashed against a wall. Cue a room of 10-year-old girls screaming and sobbing hysterically as we ran out of the form block over to the common room area a few buildings away. We got outside and things were wrong. It had been a beautiful summer day. It was dark outside. Black clouds. Rumbling thunder. Rain. Just darkness and wind and this storm rolling in, the sea in the distance looking black and choppy where we'd been playing in rock pools in blazing sunshine before lunch. We made it to the common area and noticed everyone else seeming a bit subdued and off, the entire atmosphere of camp just very tense and sad and fearful. We sat in a circle genuinely convinced we had summoned the devil himself. It was awful. We were just kids. And in hindsight it was probably just hysteria mixed with kids fooling around, just typical UK weather and the tension in the air that comes with a sudden storm. Within a few days we all calmed down and it became a huge running joke in our dorm block, playing pranks on each other along the lines of, "Adam's coming for you." It all got set aside like nothing happened. But to this day I can't explain that piece of paper flipping itself over. No matter how hard I try. I had a middle school science teacher that was incredibly mean, not only to students but animals as well. She loved vivisection especially. We had a large classroom aquarium. In order to demonstrate starfish regeneration, she took a live starfish and tried to chop it up using a blender. When that didn't work she pulled out the chunks, cut them up with a knife and threw it all back in the aquarium. As long as part of the ring is present the starfish will regenerate, but not only was this creepy, it was a bit traumatizing. The blender was something she actually brought from home. It looked like something manufactured in Russia during the Cold War. Like industrial. I'll never forget the crunching. This was about 25 years ago.